OTAs have started for the San Francisco 49ers. We're right now in the second phase of the offseason where we're seeing these position battles, these players start to really battle it out. Me and Steph, we're going to be breaking down some of these position battles, looking offense, defense, and we're going to be back right after this. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the program. We're back with another video here, and I've got my good friend Steph here. First time in a while, but nonetheless, should be a fun one.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rohan. We're officially 100 days away from the season, so this feels like a good time to check in on where the 49ers are at.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, 100 days away. We're hoping, it comes by sooner than later, but still a good amount away. But we're in the middle of the offseason here where players are now reporting. For OTAs, you're seeing, action kind of start to get together. And we have a majority of this team, here at practice. So let's break things down. Let's start with the offensive side of the ball. The 49ers, they bring in a couple of intriguing players. Obviously, your first round pick, Ricky Pearsall at receiver. And we can start there. Talk to me kind of about this wide receiver room, what you see from it, even with some of the uncertainty maybe around Brandon Ayuk and Juwan Jennings at the moment.
Yeah, I love the wide receiver room as it stands today. I think the additions of Ricky Pearsall, Jacob Cowing in the draft highlight what the 49ers want to do. And that's just adds some new wrinkles, add some things they didn't really have out of their receiver room before. And I think Ricky Pearsall really has an opportunity to get on the field right away. I mean, we're hearing some stuff about Juwan Jennings. He might have, some contract disputes. He wants a longer deal. That could open up some opportunities this offseason for Ricky Pearsall to kind of, show what he has. And I think regardless of, Juwan Jennings' status, Brandon Ayuk status, let's just assume those top three guys, along with Debo, are healthy and they start the season. I still think that Ricky Pearsall is going to make his way onto the field. And I think, maybe just different personnel groupings. I think Kyle Shanahan will probably look to experiment to add him and Jacob Cowing in for certain downs, certain situations that he likes where he thinks those skill sets that they have would fit favorably to what they're trying to do. So I'm excited about this group. And I think if you look at the first, like the top six guys who are probably going to make this 53-man roster, I think it's a really solid group of guys.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, when you look at it last year, right, you had your top three receivers. Ray McLeod still got on the field a good amount. He ends up with 15 targets, Ronnie Bell with 13 of his own. So you probably can group together around 30-ish targets outside of your top three. And that's not even including George Kittle and Christian McCaffrey in there, Ricky Pearsall, a guy with inside-outside versatility, could even see some time in the slot. That might be the spot where he kind of earns a little more playing time early on. And so you have that fourth option, which is intriguing to say for a first-round pick. But regardless, the 49ers have a plan, a kind of a 2-year plan here where you expect Pearsall to take on a bigger role maybe the season after this one when you see some change at the receiver position. But I think the top five really is kind of locked in with Jacob Cowing obviously being that fourth-round pick. He might be a better replacement himself for that Ray McLeod role, an electric guy in space, a guy who can kind of move around, do a lot of things. And to me, the reason I was intrigued by this selection as well is because it kind of deviates from what the 49ers do at receiver. They don't go for the smaller type of receivers that often because of their desire to have receivers be a key in the blocking aspect of the game. But Jacob Cowing, I mean, he had good film. He's a guy who can definitely play a lot in a lot of different roles. And so intrigued to see what kind of role he ultimately carves out. Let's talk about that final receiver position because there are a couple of names there, young and veterans. How do you kind of see that one shaping out? Who do you think competes for that kind of spot?
Yeah, I think just based on his experience, I'm putting Trent Taylor there for now until someone else shows me otherwise. I mean, Ronnie Bell certainly going to be competing for that spot as well, as will be Danny Gray, Chris Conley. I think those guys maybe have a better shot at the practice squad. But as far as experience goes, I think Trent Taylor has the edge right now, but this is obviously a really important offseason for both of those guys that I mentioned in Bell and Gray. And it could be the last time that we see Gray with this 49ers team when it's all said and done and the roster cuts roll around. But we'll see what he has this offseason. It's gonna be make or break for him for sure.
Yeah, you're going to need to see some level of improvement, right, over the last two off seasons where Gray essentially was a non-factor for much of the last two off seasons, but was able to make the roster because of that, that third round draft status with the hope that some development could occur, over these 2 years. Now you're entering off season number three. The Niners have shown in the past they're willing, to cut their losses when the situation is apparent, and it's going to be a make or break off season because this is the first time where we really see there aren't many spots available. Last year, Ronnie Bell was able to steal that sixth spot, Gray with that fifth spot. This offseason, though, you have a top five solidified and a number of names the Niners are familiar with for that sixth spot because not only do you have veteran Trent Taylor, who was obviously with the program, in the early stages of the Shanahan era, but then you also have Chris Conley, who showed that he could be, a competent receiver number six at times when he was called up from the practice squad last year, ended with 8 targets, I believe, of his own last year. But really, a guy who could play special teams, a guy with good speed and things like that, and obviously the veteran mold. The question I think also comes together with roster politics is, who can you kind of fit on the practice squad versus who do you think might not be able to slip? If you believe some of those veterans like Conley and Taylor could make it there, then, that could be the direction you go and you go with the younger guy. If you think that they're too valuable to not have on this team as, a veteran presence or, with the way that, with whatever skills that they can provide for this team, then you might need to have that sixth spot allocated to them. So I think that there's a lot of ways that this situation can go. Those four guys kind of being the top competition for that sixth spot. But I think this is an offseason where we'll see kind of across the roster. It's a make or break offseason for a lot of young guys.
Yeah, and I like this year's draft because it really feels like this draft as a whole, there's guys who are ready to compete. It's not a lot of guys who are like stash and see what happens. I think we're already talking about Ricky Pearsall, Jacob Cowing, of course, as well. But I think across the board, not just the receiver room, there's guys who are going to be competing with some veterans and knocking some guys out of their spot. I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let's go back to the top of the roster. Quarterback wise, the Niners, Brock Purdy, obviously the clear solidified starter. You have Josh Dobbs in there. You paid him, $2.25 million guaranteed. He seems slotted in as the backup. I want to ask you though about that number three spot. Brandon Allen's there, undrafted free agent Tanner Mordecai's there. Got two questions for you. Do you think that there's a chance, the younger guy can unseat the veteran? And also, do you see the 49ers taking three quarterbacks once again on their 53-man roster?
Well, I think they will just because they have done that in the past. Although this is probably their best opportunity to have a really solid like top two. Like you could have probably said the same thing about Sam Darnold, but that was also a year removed after like Brock Purdy's injury and all that. So carrying three, I think made little more sense just insurance wise. So I wouldn't be surprised if they stuck with three. Now, as far as Tanner Mordecai like potentially slipping in to be the third guy, I mean, I think we've seen that anything is possible, and Brock Purdy certainly being the best example of that. So I wouldn't put it past him. I just think as far as experience goes, and he's been a long time backup in the league, and I think that says something, right? It means you're good enough to be a backup and stay around in the league. It does take a certain type of player to be able to do that. So I think as of right now, I mean, I'd say Brandon Allen has the edge, and Mordecai would probably have to show something, pretty significant or impressive to unseat him.
I agree there. I think to me, the bigger question is whether they take three, because in the past, there have been certain situations where the Niners have, justified taking three. You talk about the year Brock Purdy was the QB3. I mean, you wanted to make sure he didn't kind of leave your roster when you had Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance. Then last offseason, like you mentioned, Brock Purdy coming back from injury, just to make sure things go smoothly, you take that third quarterback in the case that you might need him earlier in the season. Brandon Allen ends up being the third guy. But Josh Dobbs is a pretty solid backup, a guy who started a significant amount of games last year. And this might be the first time in a while where you have a solid number two where you're comfortable with your top two in the sense that you don't necessarily need to go out and take a roster spot with that third guy, especially considering Brandon Allen seems like a guy who you could probably have on the practice squad as that emergency third quarterback that you end up calling up on game days. I think he could probably fit that role, and if not, Mordecai's a guy is there as well. Do believe Allen probably ends up the leader in the clubhouse at the end of the offseason, but with the way this roster is, with how deep it is at several positions, I do think the Niners will have a tougher decision than in years past in determining whether they kind of need that third quarterback on the 53 or whether they can stomach it being on the practice squad as well.
Yeah, there's like for the last few off seasons, like come roster cut time, like there's some cuts that the 49ers have to make. Or, I mean, you can argue they don't have to make them, but maybe if they didn't keep like another quarterback, for example, they could have kept this player, and instead they have to cut that player hoping maybe he gets to the practice squad, another team picks that guy up. It's happened countless times in the last few years, and then it's kind of ends up being a position of need down the line, and we're like, man, I wonder what would have happened if the 49ers could have kept that guy. So
Right.
I've really hated that. That's like the one thing I hate about the 49ers being as deep as they are, but there are some ways to get around that if you just, cut another position that maybe you don't need as much. So quarterback could finally be the year where they feel like, they can keep another guy from another position just to keep another team from picking that guy up.
Yeah, I agree. Deviating from the program a little bit, we just got some news NFL related. The Houston Texans have just signed Nico Collins to a 3-year extension. Adam Schefter reports it's worth 72.75 million, max value of 75 million, including 52 million guaranteed. Another receiver domino off the board, and this one was intriguing because they obviously went after Stephon Diggs in the offseason. 3 years though, around 24, 25 million APY. Yeah. What do you think about this deal?
I mean, I think this kind of helps like in the Brandon Ayuk discussion, although at the same time I don't think it changes much. I think we already had kind of seen the floor for Brandon Ayuk's contract, and I mean this is probably the lowest of the floor. There's no way Brandon Ayuk would get something this low, and we've already heard the reports that he's looking for something along the lines of Amon-Ra St. Brown and probably trying to push above that, right? Which is not at all surprising. He absolutely should, being the next guy up in line. And Amon-Ra St. Brown's deal for the first 3 years averages 28 million per. So, I mean, I think that's reasonable, and I don't think that changes with this. But if anything, like maybe it helps the 49ers because it kind of just diversifies the range that they're kind of negotiating in right now.
No, I agree. I mean, this one it's pretty reminiscent of the one of the first deals that happened this offseason. Devontae Smith, he got 3 years, 75 million, 51 guaranteed. Very just a slightly lower, I guess, in the total money, and then slightly over in the practical guaranteed money. We'll see what the guaranteed money at signing is, but yeah, I don't think this changes too much. I think that the floor for Brandon Ayuk, like you said, is pretty set. You're expecting a deal very similar to Amon-Ra St. Brown, and in that regard, I mean, again, the numbers. It depends on what you're looking at. Are you looking at APY? Are you looking at guaranteed at signing? I think there are a lot of different numbers that can skew the deal in either Ayuk's or the 49ers' favor. But a quick little tidbit of news there. Nico Collins, he gets an extension, another receiver domino off the board. Let's see where Brandon Ayuk kind of falls, though, among the next group of dominoes for the receiver position, because there's a lot of talented guys still awaiting deals at that position.
hopefully he is the next domino, because if there are any more, it's not good for the 49ers. It's just going to keep pushing the price higher and higher.
Right. I mean, the sooner the better. It kind of is kind of what it feels like overall. Let's go on though. We talked about quarterback. We talked about receiver. Let's go to running back here. Niners, Christian McCaffrey, very solidified there at the top of the position. You got Elijah Mitchell, who the Niners have shown an affinity for the last few off seasons. Jordan Mason in the group, Isaac Guerrero in the group. To me, it feels like this group is one of the more solid groups kind of that the Niners have on their roster with their top four. How do you feel about this group overall?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I agree. They usually, carry four running backs, and that is including Juice. So you're looking at, someone to potentially unseat the third guy, because I'm putting check at the bottom there. Obviously Christian McCaffrey, he's your starter. Obviously Isaac Guerendo is going to make this roster just based on the fact that just drafted him in the fourth round, and
Right.
so that leaves one more guy. Who's that guy going to be? That's where the decision gets a little tough, I think, for the 49ers, because you mentioned it. They have shown some kind of like loyalty to Elijah Mitchell. And I think a lot of that has had to do with, when he's healthy, he is a really good back, but he has dealt with a lot of injuries that definitely has to be part of the decision making here. And on the other hand, you have Jordan Mason, who, very different from what they have on this roster. But I mean, he can get yardage. He can, earn as many yards as he can because he's a really tough runner. It just doesn't seem like the 49ers are as convinced as the rest of us. And I think there's probably something he's lacking that, a lot of us fans are not privy to, like maybe pass protection, for example, something like with him not having the ball in his hands, something like him in practice. I don't know, Kyle Shanahan makes a big deal out of practice. And if you're not doing a good job, then you're not going to get the opportunities. So I don't know, but like at every turn, the 49ers have told us by their actions that they prefer Elijah Mitchell over Jordan Mason. So as of right now, it's, end of May here. We'll see what training camp has in store. But as of right now, I have Elijah Mitchell as the guy making the 53-man roster, despite everything else I mentioned. But just because of the injuries, I think there's still a chance that some of these other guys like Mason or even Cody Schrader can, maybe make it interesting.
No, I think you break it down well. And the question is, do you find a way to take, five running backs, including Kyle Juszczyk, or will it ultimately be four? Because that relates back to the conversation we had with the receivers, where it's more of a make or break offseason for some of these younger guys. Again, roster politics. You're likely to take Isaac Guerendo on the roster with the way the staff is talking about him, with the ammunition you traded to go up and get him. You got Christian McCaffrey. That's two. Juszczyk is obviously on the roster after the rework deal that gave him guaranteed money. And now you have Mitchell or you have Jordan Mason. History shows the Niners, like you said, have preferred Elijah Mitchell. When he's on the field, he doesn't turn the ball over. That's something the Niners really, really like. He has, he's a guy who can catch passes at times. Mason, though, has obviously looked really good when he's on the field. The question is, he hasn't been on the field that much, even though he's been healthy. And so do you ultimately move on from Elijah Mitchell knowing that you have more team control with Jordan Mason? Or do you think more so for this year where the Niners have a preference kind of between the two? And even with Mitchell being on a 1-year deal, do you kind of roll the dice there? Or, like I said earlier, do you find a way to kind of give, do you find a way to kind of get um, five guys on this team, which might mean making a cut, maybe at quarterback where you might only take two guys, or somewhere else where you might take a lower number of players at the position.
Yeah, and that's the tough decision the 49ers have to make. I would say, like, we were talking about the 49ers potentially being able to create a roster spot if they just keep two quarterbacks. If I had to choose on the entire team, what position group I would give that extra roster spot to, running back is probably at the bottom of my totem pole as far as just like priority of who would I want that extra spot to go to. So while that is a tough decision, I think the 49ers probably more likely to just make that tough decision and they'd probably be okay with letting Jordan Mason go. I think another reason for that too is because they've done it before, and like, he's made it onto the practice squad in the past, so they could try it again. But yeah, I'd probably want to save that extra roster spot for another one. We were talking about wide receiver. That's definitely one. And we got so many other position groups to talk about as well, that, would have similar decisions attached to them. So running back, I don't know if that's one I'd want to keep five.
Be fully comfortable with giving that position to overall. I agree there. Let's move on though to tight end. Tight end last year, you had four guys you put on the 53. And this is a group where you lose Charlie Warner, you bring in a veteran Eric Sober, but really the focus of the group is on the young guys. Cam Latu, who redshirted his rookie year, after a pretty after an offseason where he had a lot of struggles. Braden Willis had flashes, intriguing to see what his role could be, but he's another guy who you drafted in 2023. How do you see this tight end room right at the moment?
Well, tight end is one group that we don't have to worry too much about them being too deep. I think right now we're worried about them not being deep enough, and because after George Kittle, it's really just a lot of question marks. And I think the fact that the 49ers looked to, sign Eric Wright away from the Lions via the tender offer, I think tells you everything you need to know. The 49ers probably, as everyone else, is thinking, we need a better tight end too. And right now, Braden Willis, well, yes, he's had some opportunities. Cameron Latu, I mean, obviously they drafted him for a reason and they see certain things in him. I mean, I don't know if those guys are ready. And that's part of the issue I had with like previous drafts, that it just felt like dart throws and no, let's just see if some of these guys can work out. And now you look at the tight end room and you're like, ooh, we probably should have gotten someone who was like ready to go right away, because you're staring at questionable tight end room beyond George Kittle. So I really don't know how this shakes out. I also thought it was interesting that, even after the 49ers didn't get Eric Wright, that they kind of seemed content then after with the tight end group. Like, yeah, grabbing like Eric Saubert doesn't really move the needle very much, and it's not really equivalent to getting an Eric Wright. There were some tight ends available in free agency. I was actually surprised they didn't go after Robert Tonyan, for example. So I don't know. It just felt like they were like, meh, we'll just see what we have. So hopefully it works out for them. Uh, but yeah, I mean, those are going to be your top four guys: Willis, Kittle, Latu, Saubert. So
Yeah.
we'll see what happens.
Lee has a question here. Do you think the tight end two could be on another roster? You're waiting for a veteran cut at the end of camp. Do you think that could be a possibility?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think every team kind of, waits to see who gets cut at final roster cuts to see if they can make any upgrades. 49ers should definitely be looking to make an upgrade in that room, especially if after OTAs, after camp, Willis and Latu still haven't inspired enough confidence. So I can see that, but realistically, I mean, who's getting cut at 53, right? Like that's a dart throw in itself. So hopefully there is someone the 49ers can pick up that could potentially move the needle for TE2, but that's hard to count on as well.
Yeah, I mean, tight end is a position where a lot of teams do value that tight end two spot, and so don't know how much talent will be there. The other thing, like Steph mentioned, the Niners didn't go after one of those other tight ends that you could have had for cheap on a 1 year deal on the market. You tried Brock Wright. Apart from that, really not much
Brock
else.
Wright. Sorry, I kept
Oh,
saying Eric Wright.
you tried Brock Wright, but apart from that, really, you didn't go after any other tight end after Charlie Warner was signed. Robert Tonyan was on the on the market. You could have had a lot of other options. You chose not to. You also don't address the position in the draft. Seems like the Niners right now are content with the guys on their roster. Don't know how how well that'll ultimately end up panning out for them, but it seems right now that they are kind of pretty content with the guys that they have currently, which means You're looking at guys like Eric Sobert potentially, but mainly you're hoping that Cam Latu or Braden Willis can really take a step forward this offseason. Otherwise, you'll see maybe if they change up their personnel a little bit. Do you flex check out as a tight end a little more? What do you kind of do with that spot? Not exactly sure because they have a lot of sets where they have two tight ends involved. Obviously, really important for the blocking concepts. So yeah, at the moment, this position kind of looks like a downgrade on the backup side, and that's being said with Charlie Warner back there last year.
To your point on like potentially having Kyle Juszczyk, I remember that didn't he fill in for Charlie Warner when Warner was hurt? Well, like
Yeah,
doesn't he?
I think so.
Yeah,
I
he's
think so.
lined
He
up.
had a couple of reps out there. Yeah.
Yeah, so like I mean, he just got a new deal. Hey man, you're getting paid more money, like more responsibility. Let's go, That's that could be what the 49ers are thinking as like a plan B, like hey, we have Kyle Juszczyk if none of these guys really look ready to be the tight end too, and I mean, I'd be comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a way to get him on the field. That would make him a little more valuable for the money he's been getting. So I wouldn't mind that at all. Moving on though to offensive linemen, Niners. You draft Dominic Puny in the third round of this draft. Are facing a little bit of an injury with Jake Brendel facing knee, I believe it's knee arthritis or knee tendonitis, one of the two. He's out till training camp. How do you feel about this group, and especially kind of more in the backup kind of area where the Niners kind of have a top group kind of solidified right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, much has been said about the 49ers offensive line and, they need to upgrade and all this stuff, get all the offensive linemen. I will say this, though. I think depth wise, this is the best depth that they've had on the offensive line, maybe in the entire time that Kyle has been the head coach. I mean, I really like the pick of Dominic Pooney for the 49ers. And I think he's someone who also has potential to get on the field right away. I mean, I think it might involve an injury of someone else for that to happen. But hey, I mean, Jake Brendel dealing with some knee tendonitis, right? I mean, that could maybe impact him in this season. Hopefully not. But I mean, those are just like the opportunities that happen, when guys are playing football. Guys do get hurt, especially on this offensive line. So that could open up opportunities for Pooney to slide in that right guard spot if Feliciano's gonna would then take over at center if Brendel misses any time. I think Pooney could very much beat out Spencer Burford right off the bat. So I don't know. I'm optimistic about the depth and the versatility that a lot of these guys have, like Pooney being one of them. Nick Zakel, can I mean, they've mentioned that he can fill in at center, although that's not a spot that like we've really seen him. But I think Zakel probably makes the roster. I mean, Feliciano obviously to me was like a very like a slam dunk, underrated or like just not a top tier like free agency signing, but one that definitely paid off for them, and is already paying dividends. I think this off season, seeing as how he's taken over center snaps. So I know it's not the right tackle upgrade that maybe a lot of us would have liked, but I think it's in the realm of possibility that Colton McKivitz could improve, one, because it's his second year as a starter, and two, if the right guard has a little more consistency in it, like Feliciano being a better option than Spencer Burford. If the guy next to him is a little bit better, sometimes that helps guys perform better. So maybe that could help Colton McKivitz as well. But I like the group. I think it's not so bad.
There we go. I agree, though. When you talk about the group, people wanting the upgraded right tackle, I think the question the Niners kind of presented. I mean, you definitely argue it a little bit, but I think the question the Niners presented is, were they going to have an upgrade there available? At 31, in their eyes, they clearly didn't, And then in the second round, a guy who at least John Lynch said that they could have targeted, Roger Rosengarten. He goes 2 picks before him. The Niners then choose to trade out of the pick, identify another player that they liked in Renardo Green. They go there. And so when you look at this group, I do think that there are a couple of possibilities with the group, especially considering the injury to Jake Brendel. The Niners are trying out John Feliciano at center, played it with the New York Giants a couple of years ago. He's a guy who the Niners seem to definitely like. He has that versatility to kick out to center. And
Mhm.
that could open up a possibility for where Dominic Puny could, once he gets a couple more reps under his system, could then slide in at right guard. And to me, I think the priority for the Niners now that you kind of have Colton McKivitz solidified at right tackle is find your best 5 offensive linemen. If you view Dominic Puny as one of those guys, find a way to put him on the field, and not necessarily in a rotation, but find a way to put him on the field in a more solidified role where you can then get some continuity across the offensive line, whether that be Jake Brendel or John Feliciano at center. You can figure that out. You have the opportunity to now with Feliciano kind of taking the center reps, but I think that should be the main objective right now. I also think this could be a group where the Niners take maybe one offensive lineman less than they have in years past. Depends on the path that they go. You signed Chris Hubbard in the offseason to kind of be that swing tackle. If they view him as capable of playing both left and right, then you might not need to take 2 tackle spots as they did a year ago when they took more in that prior. But if Chris Hubbard, a guy who's played primarily on the right side, throughout his career, if they view him mainly as a right tackle, you might need to take 2 tackles. That might be where Jalen Moore enters the fold again, and you might take one less interior guy, or you might go with 9 offensive linemen. We'll see what the ultimate pattern ends up being. You got a couple of intriguing guys as well. Drake Nugent being an undrafted center, could he kind of compete? Jared Kingston kind of playing there as well in that center guard role after being there at USC. I think you got a couple of guys fighting for roster spots at the back end of the roster. Right now, I think with my initial 53 projection, I had them taking 9 because of the 2 tackles. But I think that, the main question with this group is, can you find a way to get Dominic Puny on the field? Is he one of your top 5 offensive linemen?
Yeah, I also have them keeping 9, but I mean, you bring up a great point that with so many guys being as versatile as they are, I mean, they could decide to keep 8 and just have guys who can play multiple spots. So that's very much in the realm of possibility. And yeah, Pooney is a pick I really liked. I was like a lot of people really wanting them to draft the tackle, not just for like an immediate upgrade over Colton McKivitz. I'm also thinking like future, like Trent Williams replacement as well, right? So at the first 2 picks, I was upset that they didn't go that route. But the Pooney pick was a nice save, I thought, because I thought it was pretty good value at that point. And so far, just hearing him like speak, I don't know. There's just something about him. Like I think he is like the type of guy who's gonna be able to compete right away. So excited to see what he does and how he looks in training camp.
I agree there. I think that Puny, when you think about it, a guy who might be a little more pro ready. He had 6 years in college, 4 years of experience before transferring to Kansas, where he had 2 years. He's played tackle in college. I think the question is, one, offensive line is a position that kind of takes a little bit of time to acclimate in the system, and 2, you are having the position change as well right now. And so if he can defy the odds and kind of fill those 2 questions, sooner than later, I think you got to find a way to put him on the field. But if not, then you might see this more as a pick for the future where he could, very well be a key player in the future at whatever position the Niners view him best at. But offensive line, I think, you might not be upgrading as much as fans might have hoped for next year. You have, though, continuity along the group. You got a good guy, a young blue chipper with Puny, and we'll see kind of where this group goes when training camp comes along. Let's move it over there to the defensive side. Defensive line, this is a position where the Niners, went and got a lot of guys in free agency. Consequently, surprisingly, in a little bit, they didn't go after the position much in the draft. And so now you're stuck with the group here. You got a couple of cool guys on the edge, you got a couple of guys on the interior. How do you feel about this group as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with the loss of Eric Armstead, you definitely need to fill that role, but it seems like the 49ers don't want to go with the one-to-one a replacement of Eric Armstead. Instead, I think they want to have a number of guys kind of fill that role. And so I think Malik Collins, definitely factors into that. Jordan Elliott, Gross Matos. So and as we know, like they like to rotate guys anyway. So I think we probably see more rotations in that spot. And obviously, like the spot opposite Nick Bosa. This is a group I think they always like, because they like to rotate, they like to keep 10 guys usually, I want to say. So I see them doing that again this upcoming year. This is going to be an interesting year for a guy like Drake Jackson, for example, although I do still think if they keep 10, like the number's still in his favor to make the roster, unless like one of the other bubble guys could, take his spot. That's still a possibility as well. But yeah, I think Drake Jackson really to show something, which so far it seems like he's still dealing with an injury. So yeah, we'll see if he's ready for training camp. But other than that, I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic about the group, right? I mean, I think it can't be um as far as like run defense goes, that's the one thing I really want to see improve this year. And then also, I mean, they just need to get pressure like they used to. And I think a lot of
Yep.
that did have to do with like just Steve Wilkes and the disconnect between the defensive line and the secondary, which I think we were kind of expecting that to be married a little bit better like it was in the past. So I think that opens things up for the guys that they've picked up. So I'm optimistic about that. The reason I'm like cautiously optimistic is because hey, like Eric Armstead was huge for this defensive line, and again, like you're not going to replace him. You can only like hope to get somewhat close to that. So I think with the guys that they have, I mean, they're just hoping for the best. I will say, like, I'm excited about Leonard Floyd. I think he'll have a pretty awesome season.
I agree. I mean, Leonard Floyd, I mean, obviously the early returns, it seems like a lot of people are talking well about him. And the goal, you need to get pressure. You need to get pressure. And more importantly, with Armstead not there, you're going to have to find a way to stop the run. Leonard's got Jordan Elliott, a guy who's been a solid run stopper. But the thing about the way that their defensive line is now constructed is you're considering more of a rotation now with Gross Matos and Floyd in there, and then obviously Elliott and Malik Collins. And sometimes teams find a different way to, exploit the rotation because there are certain players with certain strengths and then certain players with certain disadvantages. But I do think that the depth of this group is important. The Niners kind of went with a different strategy last offseason, top heavy, seeing can we kind of win a championship with a really strong group of three guys. And ultimately that didn't work out due to injuries. You see some some waning play at certain times at the end of the season. And this year they go for the depth option. You have two solid edge rushers opposite of Bosa that you're hoping that can make a good contribution. You have obviously the two defensive tackles alongside Hargrave. And then you have the normal depth that you've kind of had it in years past, especially on the interior. You got Kevin Givens in there, Kalia Davis, T.Y. McGill, who can all fight for roster spots. On the outside, Drake Jackson, kind of in a make or break offseason, I'd say. Austin Bryant was in there. You've got a couple of guys as well, Robert Beal, who should have a bigger role this year, who could compete. Question though is, can you put it all together? Can you have a solid pass rush where you've got pressure, but also find a way to stop the run at the high level that you were when you were, competing for championships the last few years as well?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? There's so many new pieces that they all just kind of have to work together. I think as part of the reason I think Nick Bosa's at OTAs already, just trying to get them up to speed with the system and all of that, and get to know them. Uh, so it'll be interesting. There is definitely a lot of moving parts there, but I mean, Chris Kosarick, this is what he does. I mean, he's no stranger to having reclamation projects, and I wouldn't say like a lot of these guys are really reclamation projects. It isn't like any of these guys have underperformed and they're trying to turn their careers around. But I mean, he's definitely no stranger to having new faces and making them productive in this defense. So really, really looking forward to see what they do this year.
especially, when you consider last year necessarily wasn't a down year, but when you consider last year maybe being not as strong of defensive line play as you've seen in the past, you're hoping a little bit for a bounce back for sure this year. Let's go to the linebacker position, though. The linebacker position, you've got a lot of young talent here. The Niners drafted another guy in Tatum Bethune in the 7th round here. You went with 6 linebackers last year. How do you kind of view this room, especially with the team monitoring Drake Greenlaw's injury?
Yeah, I think Devondre Campbell, they're putting a lot on him, right, to kind of fill that role. And again, like kind of like I said about Eric Armstead, Greenlaw's not the kind of guy you can just replace. And there's the reason for that is because there's a certain kind of energy that Greenlaw brings that I don't know if anyone else really has, is at least not on this roster. So Devondre Campbell, different kind of linebacker in that regard, but he's a veteran, former all pro. I know the thing with that is like, hey, he fell off a cliff after that season. Devondre Campbell seems to believe that a large part of that him falling off was, he wasn't being used correctly. And he's saying things like, hey, I'm finding my love for football again. Like, this is great. That's awesome. I mean, a lot of times that could translate to play onto the field. The 49ers hoping that's the case with Campbell. And so if you can just be, I like serviceable, like makes it sound bad, but if he could at least be serviceable where we're not like constantly wondering when is Greenlaw going to come back, man? Like, is Greenlaw going to come back? I think that could, be a fine pickup. I think a lot of people were really hoping that the 49ers would look to have someone as impactful as Greenlaw, but it's just like that's difficult to do, especially when you know that Greenlaw is going to come back at some point in the season. Like, not a lot of guys would be willing to come in knowing that they would be the third linebacker when Greenlaw's back, right? So I think that's all part of it. But yeah, again, cautiously optimistic about that one as well. Obviously, D Winters, Jalen Graham, those are guys going into their second year that the 49ers have to hope that they make some sort of a leap as well. I haven't heard too much about either of those guys so far in OTAs, so not sure what to think on that front quite yet. But yeah, hopefully come training camp time, I mean, they'll make a surge. The 49ers have had experience with having younger guys and coaching them up to be like future linebackers in this team or in this league. And hopefully like, Winters or Graham can follow that same trajectory. I thought like bringing back Demetrius Flanagan Fowles was a sound move just because like he's had experience as the third linebacker when there's been injuries. And also he has special teams experience, so I'm fine with that as well. And yeah, Tatum Bethune, I mean, he was a late pick, so not sure if he'll make the roster. He doesn't necessarily have to. He can make the practice squad, I think. Um, and like Curtis Robinson, for example, another guy that probably more likely makes the practice squad. He's reliable as well. So, I mean, there's some question marks for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes a bit of a step back without Greenlaw. But, I just think the way the 49ers play, there's an opportunity for there not to be a big drop off.
Yeah, I mean, the big question is how good is Devondre Campbell right now? I think that's the question because his 2021 season, everybody knows, he was pretty good. He's a guy who obviously has kind of declined a little bit the last 2 years. Don't know if that's more scheme related, more play related, probably honestly a combination of both for Devondre Campbell. But you're hoping that, him past age 30 is kind of getting back and maybe him playing alongside Fred Warner kind of helps him a little bit because you're going to need good play out of him if Drake Greenlaw misses time, which right now it just feels like that's the expectation, misses a few games at least. And so Campbell kind of in there. Think also when you just consider the roster, if you want to play it safe with Greenlaw, have the option of putting him on PUP. that allows you to take another linebacker on the 53-man roster or opens up a spot elsewhere if you're looking at roster politics in that regard. The young guys, Graham and Winters, two guys you really liked last year. Expect that kind of to be the same again this year. Like you said, Flanagan Fowles, if he wanted to come back, that's a move that makes sense just because it's just another option for competition. If he doesn't make the 53, he doesn't make the 53, but he has good special teams ability. You signed Ezekiel Turner, who could play in a similar Flanagan Fowles role of more of a special teamer overall. And then, the younger guys, Hayden Bethune, Curtis Robinson, obviously in there, more probably practice squad related. But I think right now, when you look at this group, the majority of it is going to be fairly solidified unless one of those younger guys takes a pretty big step up this offseason. The question ultimately will hinge on how quickly Greenlaw can return and how well his replacement can kind of play when Greenlaw's off the field. Because with Greenlaw kind of off, you're also relying maybe on two different guys in your base package rather than just Campbell. And so I think that there are a lot of questions the Niners kind of have to answer with this group, with the hope probably that Fred Warner can kind of carry them through the first a couple of games of the year.
Yeah, I think Fred Warner needs to have like one of his best seasons.
Right.
Some people think that there was a bit of a drop off at times with Fred Warner last year. I don't know if they can afford that and not having Trey Greenlaw on the field for them, this upcoming season. So yeah, Fred definitely is going to have to carry some of that load.
Yeah, no, I agree there. Cornerback, position that has now gotten, a position people have thought maybe as a position of weakness, maybe in years past, has now become a position of real strength and a position of depth. How do you kind of see this room coming out?
Yeah, again, I think corner, like some of the other groups we've talked about, is probably one of the best depth-wise that the 49ers have had with this current regime. I'm I think there's going to be some tough decisions with this group actually because they did bring in so many guys this free agency period. They drafted Renardo Green, who I think can get on the field right away. Like I think he's that good. He's definitely going to be able to compete right away for maybe like the nickel spot at the very least, right? That's where they want to start him up at. So I think Isaac Yadam as well, probably slated to, make this roster. Darrell Luter, I think, still has the edge because of just where he was drafted or him being drafted last season. So I think he still has the benefit of that doubt. But aside from that, like they also picked up Rock Yasin, who I think will definitely be competing as well. Ambry Thomas, to me, is a guy who's could potentially fall out of favor. I know he's the starter, or he was the starter during OTAs with Mooney Ward not there. But that to me just feels more like, they're keeping a similar depth chart as, they finished with last season. Since right now it's OTAs, no one's really competing for anything. No one's going to unseat anyone yet. So Ambry Thomas has that spot, but I don't know. I kind of feel like his days could be numbered just because there's better competition around. And so if he elevates to the challenge, hey, like that's good for the 49ers. But yeah, he's going to have his work cut out for him this year. I also think Samuel Womack, who was kind of like slipped under the radar, continue to make this roster. I think there's the potential that this is maybe his last time with this team as well once the cuts come around, just because of how deep the corner room is now. Chase Lucas, I believe, like they signed him more as like a special teams guy, so he has that going for him. And then Keemon Hall, I honestly don't know much about him, but obviously, like he's probably more of a camp body. Yeah, this is going to be a really deep group. I think that bodes well for the 49ers, and I think this is going to be the strong suit of their defense, honestly, just like it was last year.
I mean, I agree. I think the corner group is really, really solid right now. I mean, I think the question also is versus inside and outside. You got two guys who you have the versatility with, Lenore and also second round pick Renardo Green. And right now, it seems you have the capability of Green potentially starting on the inside, Lenore being on the outside. That's one option. You also have the other way around with Lenore on the inside, and then you have a competition on the outside with Isaac Yanum, some of the incumbent guys, and then Green also being there. I think this group, you're going to have to make tough decisions, and this is a group where it's another make or break offseason for, I think, two really young key players in Ambry Thomas and also Samuel Womack. I think Luter, you're hoping that he can kind of take a step up after injury early last offseason. He had the bone issue. And then now you're hoping, in year two, he can kind of step up as one of those man corners. You've got Yadam there. You've got Rocky Sin there. I think this is a group where you can afford to take an extra spot, an extra player. You probably end up
Yeah.
with six corners with this group. And I think that this is going to be a pretty hefty competition too. Right now, it seems to me I have three locks with Ward, Lenore, and Renardo Green, and then a close lock with Isaac Yadam, given the money you gave him and also the play that he kind of had at the end of last year with the Saints as a starter. Those last 2 to 3 spots, though, you've got a lot of options for him, and you've got some young competition as well as some veteran options who could definitely fit the mold there.
Yeah, and I also think like looking at the cornerback depth, it's a lot of we're winning now, but we also have to set ourselves up for the future because a lot of these guys signed 1 year deals or on the last year of their contracts. Ward and Lenore, for example, like I don't see the 49ers extending both of them. So it's probably going to be
Right.
just one of them that gets extended. And so this year will also serve as kind of an audition for the following year. Who's going to get that extension? I think even one of the free agents that they picked up who signed like a 1 year deal. I think even one of those guys has the potential to stick around beyond that and get another deal. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think that some of these names will be seen next year as well.
I agree. No, that's definitely the case. Now, last but not least, we've got safeties. Safeties, you've got Talano Hufunga coming off an injury, but obviously expected to reprise his role. Jair Brown, the 2023 third round pick, had a couple of starts last year after Hufunga goes down. He's back in the fold. And then you drafted a guy, Malik Mustafa, out of Wake Forest, a fourth round pick, who many have lauded that pick. How do you kind of like this room as it stands right now?
I really like this room. Hufunga, obviously coming back from injury, but he's already working on the side field during OTAs. So I feel like that's a pretty good sign that, he'll probably be back at some point around training camp. I'm not a doctor, but I'm just thinking he'll definitely be ready by the start of the season, I'd say. Jair Brown, like, man, he exceeded my expectations for his rookie season. I mean, I know he was already like a dog coming into the league, but like you hear that guy speak and he already sounds like a veteran. Just the way he carries himself, just the way that he plays, his mindset. So I'm really excited for him, like in his second year. And then Malik Mustafa, to me, I think he's going to be someone who's going to get on the field immediately as well. And, we talk about Hufunga. Hufunga, I'm expecting to be healthy. So Mustafa, I think more likely has a role on special teams right away. But I think that's awesome because special teams should be able to allow him to do everything that he does well, like moving from the top down. He's very quick to attack. And so I think all those things that you've seen on tape is something that he's going to be able to showcase and he's going to be able to shine right off the bat on special teams. And then if there are any injuries or if we do see like three safety looks, this season, then Mustafa's, the perfect guy to get on the field. And then George Odom, of course, depth, another special teams guy. I will say, like, as far as special teams goes, I think they did a good job of filling in some of those spots and maybe even upgrading in some of the spots where they lost special teams guys. So yeah, I'm excited. I think they keep those four guys. Taylor Hawkins, I know he's made some buzz last offseason and in years prior, but probably on the outside looking in again. And, he could make a practice squad case for himself once again. So that's kind of how I'm seeing it shake out. But I really like the safety group.
I think so as well. I mean, you've got pretty much two options who have NFL experience, are solidified. This is the younger group. The Niners, obviously, with Tashawn Gibson seeming like he's retiring. You've got your two starters who are going to come back with Hufunga and Brown. You've got Malik Mustafa in there who I like the pick a lot. I mean, a lot of people said it might have been the best pick for the 49ers in the draft itself. He seems like he could be more pro ready. Could that mean the Niners involve more three safety sets? We'll see. I think the one question with this group is how do they kind of fill the roles? Because Gibson was a little bit different than the safeties that the Niners have, with his skill set. And so, how do they kind of fill the Gibson role? Who kind of plays on the back end, and how does that maybe change the coverage scheme a little bit? But ultimately, I think you've got talent in the room, and you're going to find a way to fit the way that you call plays around the talent in the room. That's the way I think the Niners are going to go with the safety room. That fourth spot, I think, is open. But you've got young talent as well there. Taylor Hawkins is a guy who's impressed the first in both of his first two off seasons. You've got a couple of guys that you had last year as well on the practice squad. And so I think you've got a nice competition there for that fourth spot. We'll see where it kind of goes from there.
Yeah, really excited about that group though. And yeah, to your point about Tashawn Gibson, yeah, that will be interesting. I think like it makes sense for Jair Brown to probably take that role. I don't know if like Hufunga can really do that. I think Brown would probably be the guy I would trust a little bit more. And then Malik Mustafa, I kind of feel like has more of a similar skill set to Hufunga, where if Mustafa looks good this season, Hufunga's on his contract year. I think you kind of see where I'm going with that one. And so I that's why I kind of see maybe Brown taking that spot where he's more up top, even though like yeah, you could argue he's done a good job closer to the line as well. But I just think he's probably more of a well-rounded safety than Hufunga or Mustafa are right now.
I definitely agree there. Yeah, and I think the Niners they did prepare, kind of looking ahead a little bit in the future to see how they kind of fill in the rest of these roles. That makes sense, if you're considering that 2025 season, and so Mustafa, we'll see if he can kind of emerge into a bit of a role this year before kind of taking over into a more permanent role next year. But you've got talent in the room. We'll see. Kind of obviously injuries is also another thing where the Niners had to deal with that last year. Obviously leads to some younger guys getting into a role. But yeah, I think there's opportunity to be had for sure.
And I think Deshaun Gibson's available. He hasn't retired if there are any injuries that arise
Late
mid-season.
in training
So
camp type of thing, when he was signed the first time. Yeah, could be the
yeah,
case.
exactly.
Let's go into a couple of quick questions here from the chat. One here from Mark. If Pearsall and Cowing have great camps, do you trade Ayuk? I'll also add just a little bit. Is there any scenario here in the next few months that you end up thinking that Ayuk could be traded?
No, and the reason why is because I think that that ship kind of sailed when it happened, when the draft happened and the first round came and went. I think that would have been the prime time to trade for Ayuk because if you trade Ayuk, you want to get something you can use right away. Like they would have used a first round pick and maybe gotten a tackle or another position of need, another wide receiver. Now, I mean, that doesn't really do anything for you. Yeah, you can use whatever compensation you get for the following year, but what good does that do in 2024? And you're looking at a season in 2024 where it's like, hey, this is our like best shot, our last best shot at getting a Super Bowl with this core. So it doesn't make much sense to me to trade away Brandon Ayuk. I mean, Pearsall would have to like do something like really incredible in camp, like otherworldly. He'd have to look better than Ayuk for me to trade Ayuk. And even then, like, I mean, why not just go into the season with all of those guys? Like, if you could, and try to get a Super Bowl with them. So, yeah, I think that ship has sailed. I think same with Debo this season. I think it's more likely that next off season with Debo, those discussions will arise again. The only way that I see someone getting traded like mid-season, traded away, would be if the 49ers season just does not go the way that they expect and they have no shot at getting to the playoffs. And I mean, we've seen even this past season, the 49ers going into that trade deadline had lost 3 in a row. Um, I mean, that looked pretty dire, but they still said, "Hey, we're still in this thing," and decided to kind of double down and get Chase Young. So rather than trading away, I think more likely that, or sorry, rather than trading away in season, I think we see after this season some moves happen.
I agree. I think right now the goal for the Niners is they kind of showed in the draft. The goal is we got to compete in 24. This might be the last year with this specific core. You even already had to cut Ark Armstead. The goal is you got to make sure you find a way to compete in 24. I don't think that any trade for Brandon Ayuk helps you achieve that goal. I think you're going to get draft compensation in return. And if you were going to get draft compensation, you would hope it would have been in this past draft to actually get a player to help you compete. And so that's why I don't envision a trade for Ayuk, don't envision a trade for Deebo Samuel. I think the Niners are pretty set with this roster. Even if Pearsall and Cowing have great camps, I think that to you that is a good sign for the future. Could also mean they have an expanded role this year as that number 3 option. But I think always when you were looking for a receiver, you understood that they were going to maybe be the 5th option in the offense this year with McCaffrey and George Kittle as well in there. And you were going to hopefully see them accelerate the offseason after that when the Niners have a couple of questions at receiver of what they could do with Jennings and with Deebo Samuel. I also kind of see Ayuk and Pearsall as complementary pieces to each other with Pearsall's ability to beat man coverage. I think that it makes sense to kind of keep both together.
Yep.
But Steph, this is a great show. We broke down every single position, the position battles that could occur at every single one. Any last comments before we head on out of here?
No, I'm just excited about, again, like, this year's draft class, because I feel like this is a draft class that you see the vision and you see they have the opportunity to, like, compete and possibly knock guys off their spot. A lot of these guys are ready to go. They're pro ready. So I'm excited for training camp, and hopefully I'll see you out there.
Oh yeah, definitely excited for training camp. I'm just excited football's back. Hopefully
Yes.
we can see a little bit more of it in person. But everybody in the chat and everybody watching, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We appreciate all the support. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and go over to Steph's channel. Show her some love as well. We'll be back though very soon with some more content as we get through this offseason period. Appreciate y'all.